I think it's safe to say that walking through the Acres woods after dark is never a fun prospect. A large expanse of woodland that stretches between the main town of Morton and the surrounding suburbs, including the Marston estate, the woods have, over the years, been central to a number of strange stories and odd occurrences, from a site being used by mean-spirited jokers during the killer clown craze a few years ago, to being the meeting place for a coven alleged to have held sabbats and strange rituals there. If you are the superstitious type or even the kind of person who listens to the local news, then Acre Woods is definitely a place to avoid. If, however, alongside being a superstitious person, you also happen to be a person without a driving license or a car, then you view Acres Woods as a necessary evil. Yes, it might be creepy after dark, but it also shaves almost 40 minutes of the journey compared to walking the long way around. Besides, the thought of creepy things hiding in the woods doesn't bother you so much when you're with someone. Most of the times that I did take the route through the woods, I was with a mate of mine from work named Dylan. Dylan and I worked together at the same supermarket in Morton Town, and before that had been on the same youth football team. He was a nice guy with a great sense of humor and someone who, like me, didn't take his job at the supermarket too seriously, regarding it more as a temporary job until he completed his degree and moved on to something with better pay and less cleanups on aisle 2. Sadly, work was not the only thing that Dylan didn't take seriously. Each night on the way home, he would laugh almost until he cried at how jumpy I would get walking through the woods. To him, the idea that I could be frightened by no tangible threat whatsoever was hilarious. I tried numerous times to explain how I didn't need to actually see anything to be apprehensive, and how imagination can play tricks on you, but he would just scoff and continue to laugh even more. We had similar conversations in the past about how he had never had a sleepless night as a child worrying about monsters or things under the bed, and how conversely, I had always slept with the cupboard door firmly shut, just in case. In regards to superstitions, we were exact opposites, and he often loudly let me know it. Still, I was glad of his company on those late walks home, and though I would get jittery and start at every noise from the undergrowth, I somehow felt safe as long as it was the two of us. Not particularly because I thought we had better odds against whatever might be lurking if we came across it as a pair, because having him there as a distraction stopped me considering what might be there in the first place. Of course, now and again, when our shift patterns differed or when Dylan had some other engagement, I would have to take the trip alone. I don't mind admitting that often on those occasions I would sprint the entire way, thundering down the half-lit dirt paths in a way that was probably far more dangerous to me than any imagined threat. Dylan, meanwhile, would saunter. Never seeing a problem with the walk, he would put in his earphones and just enjoy the stroll. Until that is, the night that he forgot his earphones. To this day, I can still remember the look on his face when I arrived at work. It was as if someone had gone into his head and, like a pumpkin being prepared for carving at Halloween, had scooped out all the insides, leaving the hole instead hollow and empty. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked, gravelly, even before I had a chance to take off my coat or say hello. At first, I was going to crack a joke in response, but from the way he was tugging at my arm and by the strange unsettled expression he had on his face, I could tell immediately that this was no time for joking. "Hey, are you okay?" I asked, concerned, slipping off my jacket and throwing it into my locker as Dylan collapsed onto one of the sofa seats in the corner. One glance told me the answer was no. I glanced up at the clock, realized that I had about 10 minutes before my shift started, and decided, without a moment's hesitation, that if I was late, I was late. They could dock my pay and cope without me. This was more important. "Do you remember?" he began, his eyes fixed on the door. "A few weeks back, when I was taking the piss about the walk home, and you were waffling on about whistling in the woods or something?" I nodded my head that I did remember. Whistling in the woods was a very old tradition at Morton, and went back at least as far as my great-grandfather's generation, because he was the one who told me about it. Basically, the superstition was that you should never, under any circumstances, whistle when walking through Acres Woods after dark. My grandfather was full of pieces of useless advice. Whenever it would rain, he would say that somebody must have been singing out of tune, and he always had a horseshoe over his door for luck. But this piece of advice he took very seriously. There was a woman, he used to say, an old witch or gypsy or something, who cursed those woods long ago. If you whistle in them woods after dark, then what happens is your breath gets caught. I remember being fascinated by this tale. It was like something from a fairy tale, but based somewhere I actually knew and recognized. I asked my granddad what he meant by the breath getting caught, and he explained. It's the trees, you see. She cursed them. So when you whistle in there after dark, they grab hold of your breath with their branches, like fingers grabbing a cloth or links of cotton twine, and they just pull it out of you, winding it over and over their little twig fingers until you ain't got no more. Then they take it and give it to that old lady. I remember as a child considering how sinister a story this was to be telling a child, but I always assumed that the reason I was told so young was for my own safety, in the same way that I might have been taught to look left and right when crossing the road. I told Dylan this superstition, and predictably, he had laughed long and hard at the whole idea, though of course, he wasn't laughing now. Last night, he began sheepishly. I was walking back on my own, through the woods, and like you say, I'd forgotten my earphones so I couldn't listen to anything. Now you know I'm not scared of the woods or ghosts and things, but I don't know. I think you got into my head with all your crap about it. So to make some noise and make myself feel better, well, I started whistling. I broke into a smile. Bloody hell, after all these years of laughing at me, you big daft sod. Now you're going to try and fill your pants because you whistled in the woods. Are you for real? I laughed and moved toward him as if to slap him in the back, but he never moved an inch. It's not funny, mate. I was whistling and just, mooching along, and then all of a sudden, suddenly there was this woman, like an old lady just in the middle of the path. She had her back to me, but she was like picking stuff from the side of the path, plants and stuff, and putting them in her coat. Now to start with, I was actually a bit worried about her because, what's she doing in the middle of the woods at that time of night? But then she just walked off to the side and disappeared. Disappeared, I echoed skeptically. Dylan nodded. I don't know if there was a light or she went into the shadows or whatever, but honestly, 1 minute she was there and then nothing. Just a big patch of where she had been. Thing is, I got home later and sorted myself out to go to bed, but I kept waking up like I couldn't breathe, as if someone was sitting on my chest or I couldn't get enough air, So then I thought about what you said about the trees with fingers and how they would wind your breath up like cotton or whatever, and it shit me up. I shook my head, walked around to sit next to him, and repeated back to him the same phrases and reassurances he had given me over the years. How it was all just nonsense and stories, and that he couldn't believe a word of it. I still say the same things to myself, even now, though considering how things turned out, I'm never really convinced. If you have time after this story, try looking up a disease called Ondine's Curse. It's a real thing, I promise. It gets its name from an old German legend, and it's super rare. Only about 1,000 people in the world have it. Dylan, it turns out, was one of them. If you do look it up, you'll read that this condition interferes with your autonomic functions, specifically the one that controls and regulates breathing. What that means in practice is that you can breathe, but you have to think about it, to do it deliberately. Unlike most people for whom the process just happens automatically, for people with this condition, the automatic part doesn't always kick in, particularly when you fall asleep. For people with this disease, sleeping means not breathing, because as soon as they nod off, the body stops taking in oxygen automatically. So the body wakes them up in a panic, telling them to take a breath. People with this disease do not die of asphyxiation. They die of exhaustion and sleep deprivation, just like Dylan did 2 years ago. Nowadays, I work outside of Morton, but if I didn't, I would never walk through those woods at night. Not because I'd be too scared, but because I know I wouldn't be able to stop myself from looking. Staring up at the branches, splayed out like fingers, to see if Dylan's breath was lightly wound amongst them.